Hello, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation located in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm also a board member for iCivics, and I want to welcome all of you to day 2 of the summit. Thank you for returning. Yesterday's event was really great, and guess what? You're in for a treat because we're going to have another great conversation today with 5 people who are going to talk to us about policy and practice as it relates to civics. In a previous life, I had a chance to serve as Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in that role, I had an opportunity to work with lawmakers, governors, state board members, superintendents, and others who had to make decisions about what we do to help students at the K-12 level. Well, the 5 people who are joining me today, 4 state chiefs, one is a leader of state boards of education across the country, know a lot about this work. And at a time in American history when civics is still a great conversation, it's been a tough conversation. And what does it look like for real people who have to deal with this at the ground level? But really, as you know, at the state level is where decisions are made. And so what I'm going to do right now is to introduce our 5 speakers. I'm then going to ask questions. If you can, for those who are joining us, if you can put your phone on mute, because we're starting to hear a little background. Thanks a lot. After that, we're going to participate in a Q&A with the 5 people, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A as well. We have a chat. Some questions will come to me in the chat to ask. And again, I think this will be a very good conversation. So let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. So we have Jill Balow, who is the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Wyoming. We have Robert Hull, who is the President and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education. We have Betty Rosa, who is Commissioner of Education in New York. We have Chris Reykdal, who is the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington, and Commissioner Matthew Blomstedt, who is the Commissioner in Nebraska for their department. They've all said it's okay for me to call them, call him or her by the first name, so I'll do so. And so, what I'd like to do right now is just give each one of you an opportunity to tell us about yourself, where you work and what you do. And so, Jill, let's just go ahead and start off with you.
All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Jillian Balow and I'm the state chief in the great state of Wyoming. I'm an partisan elected state chief and serving my 2nd term in 7 years. 7 years into the job. And so I'm up for re-election next year.
Thank you, Jill. Robert.
Type your name.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robert Hull. I'm the president and CEO here at the National Association of State Boards of Education. At NASB, we build the capacity of state boards of education to lead and to govern. And so we represent the state boards all across the country and the territories, 46 states and the territories. And you know, you can answer the trivia question of which 4 states do not have state boards, but we won't take time to do that right now. That's a trivia question for you a little bit later. This is my 47th year in education and played about every role from teacher to principal to district superintendent, state superintendent, and even washed a few cafeteria dishes and mopped a few floors along the way in schools.
And along the way, I also heard Robert is an aficionado for rodeos, but we'll save that for another question. Let's go to Betty.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, from the amazing state of New York. So I just want to start by saying I'm so delighted to be with you today. As commissioner, I have the responsibility of over 3.2 million students and 700 school districts in New York. 7,000 libraries, 900 museums, and just with all of that, we also have 17 board members that are responsible for various areas of the state. And similar to many of my colleagues, I have been a teacher, principal, superintendent, borough superintendent of over 275,000 students, and delighted to be with you today to discuss our work in this area.
Thank you, Betty. Let's turn it to Chris.
I'm Chris Reykdal, Superintendent of Public Instruction in the state of Washington. We're 295 districts here, 7 tribal compact schools, about a dozen charters, although they serve really under a separate charter commission. We're elected office here, nonpartisan, and we do have a separate state board of education, about half elected by local school board members, about half come from appointments by the governor. Appreciate being here. My background began as a classroom teacher, 14 years with higher ed, specifically in our community technical college system. My roots are in social studies teaching, so this is a key part of my life and something I've tried to bring a lot of energy to in this role. Also a former legislator here in the state of Washington for 3 two-year terms. Good to be here this morning.
Thank you, Chris. Let's go to Matt.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Matt Blomstedt. I'm the Commissioner of Education in the state of Nebraska. I like to say that I'm the Commissioner of Education in Nebraska due to poor career planning, is what I say. So we've really tried to work hard to make our students college career and civic ready in the state of Nebraska. And so I joke a little bit. It's really an important role. I'm really also pleased to be the current president of the Council of Chief State School Officers. So good to have my colleagues on here, and I've known Robert Hull for years as well. So the partnerships that we have between certain government entities in Nebraska, for instance, I have an elected state board of education that hires me, and we're separate as a constitutional body. And that's always an interesting thing when we get into civics in Nebraska, because just knowing those state and local structures is really important for folks to engage in a meaningful way. And so I've given many speeches about the importance of education and public education in the understanding of civics. And so I'm really excited to be here today with you.
Well, for those who joined us, as you can see, we have a diverse panel in terms of how they actually arrived in their seat, whether it's elected, appointed, or a combination thereof. And they also bring to the experience, local experience and otherwise. So let's just go ahead and dive into the first question. And that really is, just give us an update on what's the state of civic education in your state, whether it's what you're doing at the department through rule, what you're doing through policy, or some of the relationships that you have with school systems in your state. Robert, let's go ahead and start off with you. Just talk to us from the state board level, and then we'll go to the chiefs.
Oh, okay, well, great. Well, I think it's important as we begin this conversation to say that as we're looking at state actions by state boards and what's happening, it's important to know that no two state boards are operated or governed in the same way. That every state board has a different level of authority. They have different things over which they do oversee in their state. So as you hear from the various chiefs, keep in mind the nuance of their state, that some states have direct policy authority over certain areas and others they do not. But at NASB, we try to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening across the country with all state boards. And we do so through what we call State Board Insight. We have a database that we monitor every state's agenda and all their meetings minutes, and we make that public. So that's a searchable database for anybody that's interested. You go to our website and you can say, okay, what's happened in civics education in these states in the last 18 months or the last 3 years, and you'll get that information. So that's just a useful tool if you're interested in looking at that. But over the past few years, as you know, it seems as if there's been a hotbed of national events that has driven state boards to talk more about civics education and about what we want, how we want students to be civically engaged. And so not only is this an important item that state boards always talk about, it has risen to the top. It's been the cream on the churn, if you will, because of the national events. It started with the students' engagement following school shootings. That was a part of student engagement to begin with. Then you have the protests for racial unrest. You have the elections, and most recently the role of politicians in public health. All of these have driven state policymakers to take a look at public engagement of students and preparing students to be active and prepared citizens, which that is the #1 goal of state boards, is to produce college career and civically prepared students. So that said, that's kind of the framework of where state boards have been. And if you look at the work that's been done and the impetus for the work across the country in the past several years, I think the work can fall into 3 camps. There are those states that have done work around what I would call the I guess, incentives
Okay.
where they're working on having students achieve seals of civic of readiness or a seal of civic engagement. There, so I think maybe what you're going to hear today, perhaps from New York, is a part of that work, where you know, they approved a pilot program where they have the students work toward a seal of civic readiness, and it's a part of the civic readiness pathway to graduation. Then you have the work that, like in California, they have adopted a seal of civic engagement for students to demonstrate excellence in civics education and their participation in various projects. Utah has something very similar. They just started a 3-year project that was a result of legislation that asked them to do a 3-year project around civic engagement that would lead to a graduation requirement of civics. And then in that same bucket, another example would be Arizona, who has just recently approved a list of approved programs for students to reach their seal of civic literacy. So that's the first bucket, if you will, states working around students achieving some kind of recognition, their Boy Scout badge, if you will, of civic engagement or civic readiness that leads to as a part of a graduation requirement. The second bucket of work that many state boards have been doing is around the whole issue of social studies standards, curriculum, or materials. And just in the last year, 14 states have been doing that work. And as you might imagine, that work looks different in states because of the process. Some of them have a long process. For instance, Oregon's work now says that it will be finished by 2025. So they have 4 years to get that done. Other states have recently just revised their social studies standards, but almost every one of those 14 states, as they're looking at social studies standards, are looking at amending the civics requirement or the civics content. And then also in that bucket, if you will, around standards, there are still a few states that have approved an adopted list of materials that districts has to choose from. They can only use materials that are adopted by the state board. So that's also a part of the work around standards. I said early on, one of the first things I said was every state board has a different level of influence. One of the things that almost without exception that state boards do have authority of are learning standards. That is one of the few things that is pretty consistent across states. And that's where the greatest lever is, and where people are moving to is that those 14 states that are now looking at that particular method of moving forward the civic responsibility and civic education. Then the third bucket that I would mention would be what I would call embedded, where these are not direct policies or not direct actions such as the seal of civic readiness, but you'll find civics and civic education embedded in other policies. The example I'm going to use or share with you is the Connecticut State Board of Education. They recently adopted a policy around digital citizenship, internet safety, and media literacy that mainly focuses on internet use and safety. But if you look at the policy embedded, there's a section on digital citizenship, including cyber civics. So you'll see civics not only as a standalone in terms of these seals and standalone in terms of standards, but you'll see them embedded in other places. And also, we see that several states now have begun to include civics in their work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think it's a pervasive topic. It's a pervasive piece of work that every state thinks is important and is moving forward. So I'm sure you're going to hear some great examples from the four chiefs here that are going to be talking about it. But from a national landscape, that's what we're seeing.
That's a great overview, Robert. And thank you for reminding us about the role of the territories. We often forget about them in our conversations about education. And I can also tell you that one of the things I recommend to citizens across the board is to attend state board meetings. We often think that when the legislature is in, that's where the real power is taking place, and that's definitely the case. But when many of them actually return home, minus states like California, where there's a full-time legislature, it's really the state boards where a lot of the action is taking place every month or so, and things are moving. So thanks for the great work you do there. So Mary, let's go to you. Same question, and what are you doing for your department to address the civics conversation?
Well, I'm going to use since, you talked about our seal and graduation, but the work that we did was with the task force, 33, actually Michael Rebel was the chair of that task force. So we had internal, external. So we really took our time to look at our ESSA plan, of course, and putting college, career, and civic readiness and embedding it. So to your point about embedding this into the work was also making a public statement about a seal in terms of graduation requirement. The seal itself really gets at a lot of the capstone projects, gets at a lot of the community service, gets at the issue of civic readiness and opportunities for students to demonstrate the not only community, what we call justice-oriented type of work, community building, serving, and also getting students to realize that election lesson plans, right? These things matter, being actively involved. The one thing that, to Robert's point, we have adopted recently our DEI framework and our DEI policy by the Board of Regents. That is one of our pillars, that is one of our anchors. So the whole issue of looking at diversity, equity, using that lens and inclusion, and really using that lens to drive a lot of the work related to civic readiness, and using the work from kind of a justice-oriented, strong integrated commitment to creating civic agency for students, and the work around the standards work. You talked about learning standards. That's the kind of work that we've also been doing. But we have really looked at this not only from the readiness part as part of civic attitudes, civic behavior, caring, about your community, well-being of others, looking at different point of view as well as counterpoint of views, and how do you negotiate through those? And we have very concrete examples of how students get to demonstrate, right? How do they get to share these, not only these projects, but also the fact that we are very committed to embedding this into our civic responsibilities for our students. So it's in the three buckets that you talked about, the incentives, our seal, graduation, our work. In the second bucket, in terms of learning standards, it's there. And the probably the most interesting part of all this work is the embedding this across, creating the intersections across all the content areas, and creating this also both in the what we call in the internal curricula as well as extracurricular, so that students realize that the importance about this, the sense of service, being service oriented, being actively involved, giving voice, finding your opportunity to make a difference. And so for us is civic becoming a learning experience, civic becoming part of the fabric of our responsibilities as individuals to this democracy.
Thank you. Chris, same question for you, and what's going on in Washington?
Yeah, good morning. I think the common theme amongst a lot of us is time. I work with my team in our districts, and particularly legislators. I remind them there is a finite amount of time in a school year, and we get a lot of pressure, like most of you do, to add things: more science, more math, more social studies, more civics, more PE minutes, more SEL. Sexual health ed was a very big topic in our state for the last year or two. So I first want to recognize everyone here who's a passionate leader in civics education, to say the predators are many on time. So choose wisely along the way here. What we've tried to do is recognize that we have a 24 credit graduation requirement in this state. And one of the things we did when we first got here into this office was really push for a standalone civics course. And we had great partners in the community-based organizations, great education leaders around the state. Washington State adopted a standalone civics half a credit for graduation. That is for the class of 2024. So that's kicking in soon for today's sophomores, really. It's coming up on us here. But the work goes so much beyond that. Obviously, there's a bunch of learning standards work that hopefully leads to really high quality instruction along the way. And our agency, unlike our state board, our OSPI office is actually in charge of learning standards. And we've got a great leader in Jerry Price, who's probably on this. He's been kind of doing some work for the last couple of years of building civics learning standards all the way through K-12. So making sure that educators understand there's an expectation for civics learning in every grade level, that there's age appropriate learning standards along the way so that these connect. The other powerful thing, and again, most of you are trying to do this just given the limitation on time in a given school year, is you're doing a lot of work to integrate this in other subjects so that it's the core content of civics, but maybe it's also being delivered in a way where students are, sort of getting credit for ELA or they're learning in another content area. But we have to increasingly, I think, see civics as this thing that competes right up there with STEM and ELA. I know we're all doing national mandated assessments in math and science and ELA, but as I kind of tell folks every day, do you really care if the democracy completely unravels? How much algebra we can get done? Do you really care if the civility of the country is so at risk that we fail to function as a republic? So we're trying to get educators to think about this not as a standalone subject, but as the content in which they can deliver their favorite or their certificated work in. That said, we have 29 federally recognized tribes, and I want to take a moment to say that one of the cool things in our state is we have a statute, it's an STI statute since time immemorial, and we have an expectation that every single student in this state is going to get some education about sovereign tribes in our state. And the reason I bring that up is it's not just about tribal youth and our sovereign tribal nation partners getting recognition in our curriculum, but all 1.1 million students should understand how important it is that they live within a state that is also in partnership and in stewardship with 29 federally recognized sovereign tribes. They are their own nations within our state. And we have a curriculum about that, and it's constantly evolving. And the reason I say that is a lot of you are in a similar position where maybe you have federally recognized tribes, that I would encourage you to think about something like that. Because what we knew to be the case would be that students would learn a lot about tribes and our educators would go through a lot of professional learning. But I think what was not thought about, but has been a powerful outcome, is young people saying, if I live next door to a sovereign tribal nation and I understand it has its own governance and it has its own legal protection, who controls my rules and regulations? So it's opening the doors to a lot of young people to say, if I'm learning about the Nisqually tribe or the Suquamish tribe or the Yakima Nation, who's my city council? Who's my county commission? How do I participate in civics? And I think it's a really rich experience for young people when it's done well. And we're a little bit in our infancy. The law isn't particularly new, but curating the materials and building that expectation and doing the professional learning is something that's pretty powerful. One or two other points for me. We're not done yet with sort of thinking about this question of standalone civics. Part of our challenge is we are a state that has a 4-credit ELA requirement and only a 3-credit social studies requirement for graduation, for example. And we've kind of eaten up all those 3 credits. We've determined it's going to be U.S. history in the junior year, and everyone's doing a world history 9th or 10th grade and standalone civics. And by the time you're done, we have very little elective opportunity for learners to think about social studies and civics. So we're going to put forward a bill this year, sponsored by my office, that will actually combine the 4 ELAs and the 3 social studies and say, why isn't it 7 credits of social studies ELA, no fewer than 3 in either one? So students could take 3 ELAs and grab a 4th credit, 2 semester courses or a standalone. And we think we can get back more civics as choice courses for students, more econ, more psych, more soc, anthropology, ethnic studies. It's a really powerful way for students, I think, to build a master schedule for themselves in their 4 years of high school in particular. It still meets learning standards, but really reopens the schedule. And we're seeing more and more appetite for that. Subsequently, we're going to try to do the same thing in math and science. We have 3 math and 3 science with 2 lab in our state, 6 credits. We want to combine those and say no fewer than 2 in either one, but start to give students the ability to explore more. So again, lots going on in Washington State that is both initiated by OSPI, our office, delivered and deployed in terms of learning standards and professional learning led by our team and our community-based partners. But we've partnered with our legislature to create really that ultimate accountability, which is the requirement for standalone civics, the requirement to have tribal sovereignty curriculum, the requirement to embed all of this in grades K through 12. And so great partnerships, hard work. Thank you all, particularly if you were in a classroom teaching the work. And if I have one more moment here, I will just say, if we could all continue to evolve our language from civics to civics and civility, that would be really, really powerful. It is one thing to teach 3 branches of government, how a bill becomes a law, the structures of our republic. It is a totally different thing to build a civics curriculum that has high expectations for civility, teaching students how to be digitally literate, how they understand information, and how they respect and treat others with dignity. That is such a desperate component right now of civics. And I think young people are craving it. And I think a lot of us who have been in the seats for a long time have an old paradigm of civics as how decisions are made, how resources are distributed, and how power is divided. Right now, it is about young people trying to figure out how to work with each other in a world that tells them they need to be one team or the other. And every time they pick up this device, they are reinforced with their current construct. Their music, their politics, their sports, their chats, their groups, their music, they are reinforcing their worldview every day. And these algorithms tell them you are always right. And if someone disagrees with you, they are always wrong. And it is the power of civics and civil education that transforms that in classrooms. So thanks to everybody who's a part of it. Appreciate it. Thanks, Gerard.
Thank you, Chris. Matt, tell us about Nebraska.
Yeah, and so just again, really great things that great examples of the work that's taken place. One of the examples from Nebraska, we've of course recently, I don't know what recently is in the pandemic. I can't remember exactly when it was, about 2 or 3 years ago. Passed our most recent version of our social studies standards, and included many things that are about inquiry in the study of social studies. I think, as Chris was pointing out, you spend a lot of time on these assessed areas of instruction, partially driven by the drives for accountability on this. But it's like, without that relevance that I think the broader social studies bring to our students, it becomes really hard to tie that together. And so I'm really excited for that particular work. But one thing I wanted to share with you is we also had, like many states, maybe had an old Americanism law on the books that is always causing some type of problem, because there's actually portions of the law that are unconstitutional. There are portions of the law that reflect back on prior times that aren't necessarily relevant for our current. And so we really worked on trying to modernize that. We had legislators that really wanted to push just on an assessment around civics, right? And actually trying to use the test for immigration and naturalization as the test that ought to be in place. And we've seen that across the realm. And we push back against that as a state board, as a commissioner of education. I'm like, that's not enough. That's not like, that's a really basic information. And our social studies standards are so much more deep than that. And so we were able to engage the legislature at that time and the education committee that was working on it in a more meaningful conversation about how to actually have things that are about the performance of students, and actually the participation of students in local government. And I'd love to tell this little story. I went to visit my daughter's class when she was about in 4th grade. She's 8th grade now. And this kid comes up after, I was doing the dad thing and giving the, what do you do? This kid comes up and he's like, I just have one question for you. And are you part of the executive branch, the judicial branch, or the legislative branch? And I'm like, what a great question, And so what I find is there's this, students are looking for the relevance to the learning in the classrooms, and how can we actually make that come to pass? And so part of our legislation that included these engagements, that students would actually participate or go to a local public meeting of some type and actually write something about it. So what Chris was talking about, time is always this challenge in our school setting. But if your elementary teachers, if your high school teachers, junior high teachers are all thinking about how that takes place in an English course versus how that takes place in a social studies course. If it's only the social studies class that you're going to learn about civic engagement, we're missing the mark. And so we can find that in mathematics, we can find it in every content area. And so really trying to tie this together in our approach in Nebraska is largely about providing some of those flexibilities. And I think, Chris, by the way, I love your point about minimum classes, because even though we can talk about being flexible, teachers still have to figure out how to make that work on the ground. And I think just finding ways that we can do that more effectively is really important. I'll add, we build a lot of partnerships. We have a partnership with a group in Nebraska called Civic Nebraska. Actually, the executive director happens to be a legislator in Nebraska as well. And so our partnership with them is really about student engagement in a lot of different settings across the state, including before and after school programming, including, working with teachers to find innovative ways to be engaged. And so that's a really important part of our work as well. I go back and to my time in probably, I guess, in high school and the sponsored by the American Legion, the county government days in Nebraska, right? And I went off to county government day thinking I wanted to be an attorney. So I want to spend time with the county attorney, or I want to spend time with the district court judge. And instead, I got to spend time with the county weed supervisor, right? And so the county weed supervisor, I learned so much about civic engagement and what that meant for a law, about what that meant for an economy, and what that meant for the area that I lived in. And finding those types of connections for our students, making it relevant. When the Commissioner of Education shows up, he can answer that question. Are you part of the legislative, executive, or judicial branch, right? And the reality is kids remember those experiences as much as anything. And so we've really tried to build a system that allows for that and rewards that in our schools. And we'll continue to do that. And that's part of our goal, just to make sure that all of our students are really civic ready, in addition to college and career ready.
Thank you, Matt. Jill, talk to us about Wyoming.
Thank you. And there's a little bit of a love-hate relationship with going last, because I'm madly jotting all of the words of wisdom that my colleagues have shared, and not quite sure how I can compare. But I think every one of us on this call and Civics Now has certainly laid this out well with their principles. But there's a recognition that civics has really become a second-tier subject. In Wyoming, it remains untested, and because we have focused on other subject areas and measured them, it's become less of a priority. There's been a reduced investment in curricular materials by school districts, and we've curtailed time spent on civics education and course requirements, again, as my colleagues have laid out. What happens when this happens is that it becomes an issue of concern for our constituents and contention, and there's a sense of urgency. And when we don't have a policy framework that really prioritizes civics education, and we have contention and a sense of urgency, that usually means that we're reacting instead of being proactive by really creating an effective framework that puts policy in place now and in the future to accommodate a higher quality and more prioritized system of delivering civics education. So working to change that in that context of contention and urgency is not a great way to sustain it. And so taking a step backwards and really encouraging educators in the state of Wyoming to take a step backwards and look at the whole picture is sometimes a challenge, but it's exactly what we need to do. So I want to talk about just a couple of the good things that are happening in schools. And again, I'm not sure that this is limited to Wyoming, but we have some great things happening in schools. We have some schools that have course requirements that are rigorous for students. We have some schools that take part in projects like We the People and History Day. We have some communities that have local efforts by community leaders to engage students. I mean, civics education starts in the classroom and in the community and in the neighborhood. We don't have to look at what's happening in Congress and the White House to get a great civics education. And finally, we have an opportunity to work across different branches of government, and Matt kind of talked a little bit about this, as well as education institutions, including post-secondary, but that's not happening everywhere. It's only happening in pockets. So we do have some great things going on, but what's missing for Wyoming is strong standards, strong course requirements, a requirement for the application of civics, and prioritizing the subject with teacher training, curricular investment, etc. And I thought Robert did a really great job of laying this out in the 3 buckets that he talked about. And I think all of us can look at all 3 of those buckets and say, yeah, we've got a few great things. We've got a few policies in place that work for us. We've got a few embedded or integrated practices, and we've got a few places or ideas about state recognition, but we aren't doing it. And so, we aren't doing it with fidelity or in a way that sustains that. So just now to put a Wyoming context on it, we've had standards, the same civic standards in place since 2014. And before the Fordham report came out earlier this summer, which most of us on this call are probably familiar with, we knew that as standalone standards, our civic standards were inadequate. But what I hoped as state chief is that an initiative or work around that would help strengthen those standards. In the end, it probably hasn't, even though, again, we have We the People, we have History Day, we have some states, or we have some districts that assess. We don't have fidelity. We don't think about equity when we deliver a civics education to the students of Wyoming. So we'll be revising our standards in 2023, and that's over a year-long process. So our work will commence very soon on that. And we have a lot of lessons learned in Wyoming that were tough lessons learned, but they're good lessons learned. They've caused us as a state to really slow down our standards development and adoption process and really take a lot of stakeholder input along the way. And I would imagine, I mean, just looking again, kind of clicking back to that contention and sense of urgency felt by a lot of people around this, I will front load that process as well as I can for the members of our state board and the members of our standards committee to really have the best information that they can through some focus group work, through some pulling national experts in, looking at the states that do have better or higher quality standards than Wyoming, looking at some of the great frameworks that are emerging from groups like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, the Roadmap for Educating for a Democracy, and so many other great tools are emerging to really assist schools, because for some of us, this is uncharted territory. So like Washington, we really have a bright spot with our Indian education for all. That's a statute that exists. And we did some really hard standards work that was called out in the Fordham report for being the right way to come to standards. We incorporated our tribal elders and community members in the development of those standards. So I imagine that lesson learned will also go into how we redevelop or revise our social studies standards. So lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. And I would say the biggest challenge for Wyoming right now is that this is such a heated topic with lots of issues that can distract us from the work of creating a framework that sustains through time, and making sure that we have a comprehensive approach to civics, not an issue controlled or issue based or action based approach to civic standards and policy framework. And as Civics Now states over and over again in their framework, the moment is now. And we really do, as state chiefs, have sort of this marching order, if you will, to lead very inclusively through this process of standards revision, policy framework revision, as well as implementation of practice and curriculum. So I'm excited, but also very nervous for what the future holds, because we have a big task ahead of us as state leaders and also as states and communities and neighborhoods and schools.
Thank you, Jill, for adding your words of wisdom. They were definitely great assets to the conversation. When we think about civics in practice, and particularly what we teach our students, we'll take a piece of legislation focused on civic education. It'll make its way through the House and Senate. It'll cross over, go to committee, finally make its way to the governor. The governor will sign, and then everyone throws confetti and they say, we've done it. And yet it's state chiefs, secretaries, superintendents, and school board members at the state level who know the work has actually just begun. And some of you have actually hinted at that. So I want to do a deeper dive for a couple of minutes. So Jill, let's start with you. What's the most exciting opportunity you see right now on your plate as it relates to advancing civic education? And what's the biggest challenge? And we'll start with you, and then we'll let your colleagues follow.
All right, and I think you said my name, is that right, Gerard?
Yes, I'm letting you go first this time.
Just making sure. Yep, that's
Yeah.
great. I think the biggest challenge, and I'll reiterate and maybe just go into a little bit more detail on it is that the issues that are surrounding civics education are really challenging in our communities, in our school board rooms, in our states, and in our nation right now. In fact, they've kind of bled over into maybe what's considered the culture wars and into what polarizes or divides us as a country. And we see that playing out in our school board meetings every week. And so as to the greatest extent possible, as state leaders, one of our biggest challenges is to be proactive about that. And to really, for me, it's going to be holding opportunities for stakeholders and focus groups, et cetera, to identify their values around this work. And my hunch is, my hope is, my hypothesis, which better be true, knock on wood, is that we share the same values as Americans. We want our kids to have a comprehensive civics education. We want our kids to responsibly and kindly engage in civic opportunities in their schools and their neighborhoods, communities, states, and beyond. And so identifying the common values is both a challenge in this environment, but it's also a really great opportunity to refocus our energy on this work of ensuring that every student has access to a high quality civics education. And the best way to do that is, and for me, there's a lesson learned, and I'll stop for just a moment and say, I thought that even though we have lackluster standards, even though we have statute that sort of covers what we want it to cover with respect to civics education, an initiative around civics education was not enough. I supported a common assessment, a common social studies and civics assessment in our state. It went in front of the legislature and failed 3 different times. Probably not the right approach to use anymore. We attempted to have some kind of state or even community recognition for those civic superstars, civic readiness superstars. Tough to do if you don't have a good policy framework to back that up. And so I think for me, my lesson learned is taking a step backwards and saying, as great as initiatives and projects are, this is about a whole lot more than that. And it is about maybe policy at the heart of that. So engaging our State Board of Education, engaging our legislature, engaging all 3 branches of government at some level, engaging our schools and engaging the public is, again, both a challenge, but a really wonderful opportunity to sort of see this all take place in action. Because if we can pull this off, that's exactly what we need to be teaching our kids to do. And this is uncharted territory. We all recognize, everyone from NAEP to CCSSO to, and when I say NAEP, that's the National Assessment for Educational Progress, CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers, NASB, the Organization of State Boards that Robert represents, and so many others. We all see the value in doing this work. So if we can really, again, kind of step back from the issues and lean in on the values that we share and the work that's ahead of us, we will find ourselves in a really good spot. Thanks, Gerard.
Oh, thank you. Betty, let's go to you. I want to make sure we give time for Q&A, so if you can give us each one of you a 2-minute response on that, and then we'll open it up for one of the first questions I received. And this one's for you, Betty.
I just did. Okay, it was not letting me unmute at first.
Thank you.
I'm gonna take this in a slightly different, partly because of what Jill said. I think one of our biggest challenges, and the reason I mentioned DEI, is because we talk about shared values, but then I often ask myself, whose values? We talk about shared, common, culture. Whose culture? So I think part of our challenge is the single story and the single stories that are told, and told from what angle, and told who tells these stories. So one of the biggest challenges we have is that in many ways we have many marginalized groups that have not been part of the story, if you will. And so on a very optimistic side, I'm hoping that we can look at issues of tying civic to culturally responsive teaching as well, looking at the issue of moving from that single story and who's included in that story, and how do we tell the story of everything from looking at the issue of racism and systems that have in fact excluded. And so the power in telling the story needs to become part of our civic responsibility. And so for me, civic engagement, civic power needs to become part of this conversation. And some of this is very challenging. As we all know, we're going through the issue of the counter arguments, right? We're going through the restriction of which story continues to be told, and which story continues to be told at the exclusion of other voices. And so that to me is probably right now the biggest challenge we have, and to empower our young people to really want to be part of demanding that we go beyond, whenever I hear the shared values, I often think, whose shared value, who's represented, whose values, right, do we talk about? So the foundational part of this has to, what weakens our house, if you will, in terms of the pillars that support the house, is that we do not tell the complete story. We do not tell the whole truth. And so for our sake, we really have to step into a whole different conversation about the story, the whole story. And so I see that as very, very powerful. I think our DEI is having, as you know, when we adopted in New York, we've had some parts of the state that, we are probably one of the most segregated states in this country. And so part of what we're seeing is that pushback of privilege, the pushback of those that have been part of the story, that want to continue to really make sure that that remains the story versus telling the whole story. But
thank you. Hey, Betty, I'm going to have to do this really quickly. I want to make sure I get to the other two, because we're going to have 3 questions. from students are going to come up later on to make sure we give them time, but thank you for your points. Chris, question for you, same thing.
Thank you. I'll yield some time to Matt and others here, maybe a little bit. Mine is at a smaller grain size. So I think Jillian gave a great concept sort of at the molecular level of where we're going in civics, and Betty with the powerful idea that if individuals don't have agency and they don't see themselves in the work and they don't identify their role, their power, their opportunity, their privilege in the work, then it's hard. I'm going to take it one grain size smaller, and it seems a little unusual, but I think the most powerful thing we do in civics for doing it well is really powerful SEL work, social emotional learning work in early grades. This idea of helping students identify self, finding their voice, and then the respect of each other, being able to sit across from somebody who has a different opinion than you, and managing young people through what that means. That doesn't have to mean conflict. It can just mean difference, and it can mean understanding and listening, and it can be finding shared interests. And believe it or not, that young brain, even in preschool, is doing that already. They're trying to operationalize that already cognitively. Really structured social emotional learning, when it's done well, is the foundational framework for really good civics later on, because you were talking about resources, power, and privilege, and how things are divided, separated, sorted, and who's privileged and who's underrepresented in our world. That is just the truth. Right, that is just the truth of it. And the more we build those blocks early on, and really getting young people to exchange in respectful dialogue, controlling their emotions, understanding how to respond to adversity, that's really what SEL is all about. And I think it's a big building block to great civics education long term.
Thank you, Chris. Matt, your turn.
Yeah, I just think I find it interesting as we have this conversation that ties so well to what I think just happens to show up in our statutes around American civics. So the previous section before American civics is multicultural education, right? And so that one followed by the civics engagement, followed by character education. And it just happens to fall that way in our state statutes. But as you're all talking, I'm like, I even had to check. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's how it runs. And I looked. And I find it fascinating because none of these things can happen in isolation. I think what Chris was talking about earlier, and what Chris was talking about on SEL, none of this happens as a separate subject matter to the conditions of our families and our children and how they see themselves in the world, how they see their histories of their people in the world, right? All this has to tie together into these conversations. So I think there's many, many things that we can get to deeper, more meaningful conversations. I saw somebody put in the chat, where's the student voice in this? Actually, if I look through history, education doesn't allow for much student voice generally, right? And so even when some of these things are created, we teach kids about governance, yet we give them no sense of governance necessarily in their educational experiences. Many households don't give them that sense of engagement in any particular way because, dad said so or whatever it may be, right? So we end up in that very much that parental role, even in education. And we have to think differently because we are training our next generation of leaders to be meaningfully engaged and to be civic. I'll just to be civically engaged and to be civilly engaged. So and yet we have to model that more effectively, I think, in our work. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So Robert, last one, and then we will open it up for the student questions.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to say much other than that we need to make sure that as we are state policy leaders are looking at this agenda and looking at how to deal with this whole idea of civics is not to lose the intentionality of what we're about in terms of a roadblock of not becoming reactionary. It's one thing to seize the moment of opportunity, but it's another thing to do that in a reactionary manner to some type of ideology. So I think Betty hit it right about let's deal with the values that we're wanting to instill, not the ideology that is sidetracking us currently.
Thank you. All right, on your screen, you're going to see there are some questions that we have from students. And in fact, someone had mentioned, as just one mentioned in the chat, where's the student voice? Do we have 3 questions? I'm going to see if that's going to come up on our screen. And it is moving up now. Okay, and these were pre-recorded, not live, and so I'll turn it over to the staff.
Right, and I am in 12th grade. I go to school in Rochester, New York. I would like to ask the panel, how can students get more involved in state agencies' efforts to strengthen K through 12 civic education in their respective states? Hello, my name is Ariana.
Excellent. But I think it would be best, if possible, to play all three of the questions, given the fact that we have about 6 minutes left, and then we'll allow our panelists to respond to one or more that they like. So that was question one. What's question two?
And I go to school in Queens, New York. My question is, with so little time dedicated to civics, can you speak to how civic learning might be embedded with other subjects to get more class time?
So there's some love for New York.
Hi, my name is Amita Smythe.
We have one more.
Hastings, and I'm in 9th grade. I go to school in Centralia, Washington, and I care about civic education because the more information people have, the more informed their vote will be. Sometimes student involvement comes through student representation on various decision-making boards. I'd like to ask the panel, what are your suggestions to both students and other board members on how to ensure that the student's voice is respected and taken into account?
All right, we have three questions, one from West Coast, one from the East Coast. I'll leave it open. Take the question as you want, and we'll go from there. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to keep that in mind. So whoever wants to go first can.
I might jump in just with one comment, is that that one of the things that we at NASB have been very deliberate about over the past 4 or 5 years is getting state boards of education to recognize the role of student voice in policymaking. And probably 6 years or so ago, there were like 2 or 3 states that did that. As of now, 29 state boards of education recognize student voice in the policymaking process. And that varies from, some states have a student advisory council. 7 states have actually student members who vote along with everyone else. They sit at the table and they cast a vote with the regular, with other board members. Then there are 17 states that have board students sitting at the board table. They don't cast a vote, but they are there. So 29 states, we've gone from 5 or 6 to now 29 who have a student member. Just in the last year, 2 states have gone through the process of adding a student member. I encourage state boards to take a look at incorporating student voice. If there's something constitutionally that prohibits you from doing so in a way that they actually vote, you can expand the advocacy there. And actually, it's intentional. You have to be intentional about it. So I just wanted to throw in that state boards have made a step in that direction, and we're encouraging others to do so.
I just want to double down on Robert's point here. And I think, again, as a old social studies civics teacher, and many of you have been doing this for a while, the nationalization of cable news has a lot of our young people believing that they got to go from making their lunch in the morning to raging on Congress or the president. And I think the powerful thing we get to do in classrooms is to help young people understand who is most impactful in the spaces in which you are being pushed and pulled. And our education system is very much a function of SEAs based on our national framework. Our U.S. Department of Education has very little role. They have very little movement with respect to learning standards. Our SEAs are essentially distributing resources. So getting young people to understand how powerful it is to be present in school board meetings, not just be the 1 or 2 students from each of the ASBs who sits on it, whether they're voting or advisory, but to be present in the content and the delivery of decision-making in local school boards, I think is really, really powerful. So that's not to say we don't have an advisory committee here that we consult with at our SEA. Our State Board of Education has 2 school board members. There's legislation being considered this year to make them voting members. There are places for students to engage at higher levels, but the really impactful place that I think is really accessible to young people in scale is to get them really engaged in their local school boards. So a huge push for Robert NASB members. Get them in front of those boards. It's a good training ground too, when they want to go to their state capital and really push hard for some statewide policy as well.
I'm going to jump in on question 2 and just kind of reiterate that civics education doesn't and civics in practice doesn't have to be only at the state level to have an impact. It starts in the classroom and the neighborhood and the community. Over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, the U.S. Chambers of Commerce have been really engaged in civics education. And I like that approach from a community level. As state leaders, we all have opportunities to speak to Rotary clubs and Chambers of Commerce and Kiwanis and everyone else. And my message to them is always, you need to have kids at your luncheons and at your activities and at your service projects every single time you're doing things, because that's civic education and civility in action. And so I don't think it's always a matter of being involved in state policy. Some of that can really play out and happen at the neighborhood and the community level. And so I love how Robert opened with this concept of state recognition and the seal of civic readiness. I'd love to see communities adopt a seal of civic readiers, where if you're a community or an organization and you're incorporating kids into whatever projects or whatever clubs you host, that you receive some kind of symbol or some kind of recognition as being a civic readier. So there's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
You know what? I'll add one quick thing. First of all, just lots of great points and probably more than we can cover on the things I'd like to be able to share. But on student engagement, as Robert noticed or mentioned, trying to engage students in the statewide part has been a challenge. We've done it on different panels, different discussions, but what really frustrates me is that it can't become very meaningful. And so I've been contemplating how we can actually have a state student school board that we would actually staff, and that actually, instead of just being, they can't participate, so to say, in the votes or anything on our state board, but I would actually prefer that we actually start doing that. And through Civic Nebraska, we actually have a state legislature, or state student legislature that's been established as part of that process, and they actually meet. And so there's some really neat things that can be done, and I think we have to find ways to get that engagement at that level. But I think also, to echo, happening at the local level is even more powerful, like county weed superintendent, right? I mean, I'm just going to say that's the most powerful moment that I had as a student, was actually that.
Thank you. And Rosa, you can close us out. I mean, Betty, yeah, you can close us out.
Well, I think we're in the process of looking at students joining our Board of Regents. And we've been very actively involved with many of our students when they do the applied learning of the standards in the mock, coming up here and spending a couple of days. But also my brother's keeper, all of our task forces have included student voices, which is why I circle back to where I started, the importance of student voices in and finding meaning and making sure that they're actively involved in everything we do, from the state to the local and to all the activities. So for us, the learning process is really, the applied learning process of civic is critical.
Thank you. Well, Jill, Robert, Betty, Chris, and Matt, thank you so much, first of all, for being a part of this conversation, for your public service. While we have over 74 million school-aged children and number of school districts, we don't have a lot of state leaders. And so thank you for your work. For those of you, thank you for joining. We're going to switch now to the next session. Make sure that you find your unique logon link sent to you in your day 2 email so you can transfer over to your next event. Again, thank you for your time, and let's keep it civil and let's move civics ahead. Thank you.